In ancient Athens, there were no professional detectives. There was not even a real police force. The Athenians did have a group of public-owned slaves taken from the Scythian lands north of the Black Sea, whose job was to maintain the peace. They were armed with bows and arrows, but their job, though mainly involved tasks such as putting down riots, keeping people from murdering each other in the assembly, and basically ensuring public order. They did not do investigations of any kind. Instead, the sole responsibility for investigating a murder lay with the family of the victim. If the victim's family wanted their relative's killer caught, they had to conduct the investigation and track down the killer on their own. It was a drastically different system from the one we have today here in 2022. Thankfully, we do have a number of surviving accounts of murder trials from ancient Athens that give all kinds of interesting bits of information about the various investigations that led to the defendant being put on trial. People back then could get away with a lot of questionable investigative techniques that would certainly never fly today. There are several famous surviving accounts of murder trials in ancient Athens. For instance, one very famous murder trial in classical Athens was the trial of Helos, a young man from Mytilene, for the murder of Herodes, a young Athenian man who was probably a cleric. We know about the murder of Herodes from a speech written by the Athenian speechwriter Antiphon, titled On the Murder of Herodes. Antiphon wrote this speech as a defense for Helos to deliver to the jury at his trial. The trial probably occurred in around 419 BC. This particular trial was highly unusual, both because the defendant was a Mytilenean rather than an Athenian citizen, and because the defendant was charged not with murder, but with being a malefactor. The first part of the speech deals primarily with Helos' complaint that the proper legal procedures have not been followed, since he was being tried in the regular court as a malefactor, even though murderers were supposed to be tried in the court on the Areospagos. In the second part of the speech, Helos describes how he went on a ship with Herodes to the port of Aenos in Thrace. Helos was going there to visit his father, and Herodes was going there to release some Thracian slaves who were being ransomed by their relatives. There were other passengers on board the ship with them, including the Thracian slaves whom Herodes was going to release. Due to a storm, they were forced to dock their ship at Methymna, on the north end of the island of Lesbos, and change ships. According to the defendant, that evening, he and Herodes spent much time on the deck of the ship drinking. Then, well after dark, Herodes left the ship in a drunken stupor without anyone to accompany him. He never returned. The next morning, Helos and the other members of the crew sent out a search party to look for him. The search party found no trace of his whereabouts. After the ship that Helos and Herodes had been on returned to Mytilene, Herodes' family had the ship searched, and they claimed to have discovered bloodstains, proving that Herodes had been murdered. The blood, however, turned out to be sheep's blood left over from a sacrifice. Consequently, Herodes' family bought two of the slaves who had been crew on the ship and brutally tortured them to get them to confess that Helos had murdered Herodes. The first slave refused to confess, insisting that Helos was innocent. The second slave, however, declared, after being tortured for several days, that Helos had gone ashore after Herodes and murdered him with a rock. He claimed that he knew this because he had helped Helos to dispose of the body. Once the slave confessed, Herodes' family decided to kill him as punishment for having allegedly had a role in the murder of their relative. Just before they killed him, he recanted his confession, declaring that he had made the whole story up to get them to stop torturing him. Despite his recantation, the family killed him anyway. All of this was done completely in accordance with ancient Athenian trial proceedings. Ancient Athenian law dictated that the testimony of a slave was not admissible in court unless it had been extracted via torture, because it was assumed all slaves were inveterate liars, and that the only way to get them to tell the truth was by torturing them. Furthermore, it was completely legal for a person to kill their own slave, because slaves were considered property and not human beings. The outcome of the trial is unknown, because we only have the speech Adiphon wrote for Hellas' defense. Another famous murder trial from classical Athens was the trial of Euphiletos for the murder of Eratosthenes, which we know about from a speech written by the Athenian orator Lysias, titled On the Murder of Eratosthenes. Lysias wrote the speech for Euphiletos to deliver to the jury at his trial. The exact date of the trial is unknown, but it occurred sometime between 400 and 380 BC at the law court in the Delphinion near the Athenian Acropolis. Euphiletos is characterized in the speech as a noble, upstanding, elderly Athenian citizen who married a young woman. Then, at his mother's funeral, Euphiletos' wife was spotted by a handsome young man named Eratosthenes, who seduced Euphiletos' slave girl and convinced her to corrupt Euphiletos' wife and persuade her to have an affair with him. Euphiletos describes how the slave girl corrupted his wife and how she was seduced by Eratosthenes. He emphasizes that he was totally unaware of this affair as it was going on, even though it was happening right under his nose. He then describes how he learned of the affair from an old woman. He then interrogated his slave girl and found out that the story was true and that his wife was having sex with Eratosthenes. Euphiletos states that he waited for Eratosthenes to come to the house to have sex with his wife. Then, once Eratosthenes arrived, Euphiletos gathered some of his friends. He and his friends burst into the bedroom, where they discovered Eratosthenes in the very act of having sex with Euphiletos' wife. Euphiletos states that he killed Eratosthenes right there on the spot. In the speech, Euphiletos admits that he did indeed kill Eratosthenes, but he insists that his killing of Eratosthenes was completely legal because Athenian law at the time permitted a man to kill another man if he caught him in the act of adultery with his wife, and he killed him on the spot. So therefore, Eratosthenes' murder was completely legal and completely justified. We do not know what the outcome of the trial was, because we only have the speech Lysias wrote for Euphiletos' defense.